You can't have some woman who has lived in the US, in the UK, and Australia, such as Yalda Hakim. She likes to do this a lot. You can't have her be representative of your average Pashtun Afghan woman who lives in the countryside, who wants completely different things. Who, looking at this from a historical, political, and non-biased perspective, which is what the North would like you to have, would not look at what happened to Saddam Hussein, what happened to Muammar al-Gaddafi, and what happened to Ayatollah Khamenei, and not decide that what Kim Jong-un did was the right thing to do. The two best things that happened for the region was Narendra Modi deciding to attack Pakistan in May 2025, and the Israelis and Americans deciding to attack Iran in June 2025. When I look at Iran, I look at an entity which has given the US so much grief compared to any other war that it has fought. So I think that Pakistan has played it very, very cleverly in terms of interacting with Iran and making Iran and the US come to the table. At the same time, going into Afghanistan, I think that we should be very, very careful when we're going into Afghanistan, particularly the arguments for which we are going into Afghanistan.
So you've written down on Zionism and Hindutva, both how they grew out of the same fascist playbook and how that ideology then gets built into actual state policy.
In apartheid South Africa, legal jurists such as John Dugard, who came from apartheid South Africa, went to Israel and said this is way worse than happened way back when, right? When we were undergoing our apartheid.
Assalamu alaikum and hello everybody. This is Hooria Shafiq from Narr Digital Media, and today we're really pleased to have Miss Ayesha Malik with us here. She's an international lawyer, she's a director at the War Law Institute, and she's also an adjunct faculty at LUMS, and she's also an op-ed writer for Dawn. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine as well. So before we get into everything happening right now, I want to start with you and your work generally. How do you see your role differently from the general, more traditional international lawyers or law scholars?
Oh, such an interesting question. I actually usually just get asked about the law. So I ended up working in conflict zones. Immediately after doing my degree, I decided I hate the law. I was like, I'm never going to become a lawyer. And I went into development and I worked in Kabul and I worked in South Sudan. I kept on finding myself in conflict zones. The people who were critical of international law, I didn't think that they were doing it the right way. It was very critical, supposedly pro-global South, but also very much saying that the global South is doing the wrong thing too. And it was very much no, there should be peace on earth and that type of thing. And I kind of felt no, I think, we're really at a point where the West is kind of declining and you're seeing the rise of the East in the form of China, in the form of India. And I really felt there had to be a representation of what it meant to be a global South state, to leverage international law to your benefit, but also to not do it in a peacenik way, right? And I think that the Iran war is a representative of that, in the sense that if you show power and if you show that you are strong, that is the only way that the global South can have that ability to sit at the table. And so I think that I come from that perspective, which is very different from how a global North scholar would look at international law.
So you've said this before, that international law isn't really a neutral rule book. So it isn't just a neutral law of the international community. It's a system shaped by power, by hegemons, where the same rule gets applied differently depending on who's using this force. So can you please analyze what the selective justice looks like in the international law?
Yeah, so I think that when we're looking at selectivity, there are certain things that we get really wrong about the way international law is talked about, right? So in some ways, international law is incredibly democratic, right? You have decided that there is no superior power. We'll talk about the Security Council and how geopolitics is inherently very baked into the system. But you also have this idea that if you are fighting in self-defense, it's a democratic system, and that if you have suffered an armed attack, you have the right to self-defense. And that is a right given to every state, in the same way that you as an individual would have the right, if someone entered here right now and threatened to shoot you, that you could shoot them, right? So at the same time, international law does bind all states, right? And this is the one administration, I would say, that has completely had a mask-off moment. It's been we don't really care about international law. Trump has said this repeatedly, right? Before that, you had states claim that what they were doing was completely fine under international law.
Yes.
So that's why in 2003, when Colin Powell was going and talking at the UN and completely ruined his entire, legacy, he was going and saying that they have weapons of mass destruction. Tony Blair was going on TV and saying that they have weapons of mass destruction that can hit us in 45 minutes. The reason for the emphasis on 45 minutes is because you have a requirement of imminence under the law, right? Which is that we face an imminent armed attack, so we have to go in self-defense. Now, they relied on a number of other arguments in Iraq, which was also a crazy revivalist argument from the first Gulf War about the Security Council resolutions. But at the same time, at this point, going into Iran, there was very little lip service paid to international law compared to 2003 in Iraq. Yes. It almost made you miss Bush, going up and saying his, half-brained stuff about how we have to go after Saddam Hussein. You didn't have that with Trump. You had Marco Rubio kind of come out and say that we've had an imminent threat from Iran for 47 years. And I'm like, that is not imminent. And it is time restrained, right? Yeah, the notion of imminence is temporally limited. It has to be. Otherwise, imminence means nothing. If you've had an imminent threat for 47 years, well, maybe you could have had the imminent threat for another 47 years and you'd still be fine. So you see very little lip service now paid to international, which I quite like, because I feel like it's a mask off moment. Don't pretend like you did in Bush when you knew you were going to go into Iraq and you were just telling your Justice Department, make up some legal arguments that we can go and parrot. Yeah. Right now, we know, and this kind of galvanizes the opposition to it, right? Because you're like, this is now clearly illegal. We don't need to sit and be like, oh no, but they said this. Is there an argument that could be made about this? You've not made an argument, so we know that it's completely illegal. And so I think that in terms of what can happen now, I come down to this idea. I don't have this rosy tinted view of what international law can and can't do. I do think that you can quote international law by the yard, but if you have a nuclear bomb in your basement, people are probably not going to attack you, right? Like you have to be very realistic about what happens in interstate relations. And that is the most true that I can say would happen, right? So when I look at Iran, I look at an entity which has given the US so much grief compared to any other war that it has fought. Vietnam gave the US a lot to complain about. Afghanistan did too. Iraq did too. But we had that in the form of insurgencies. We had that in the form of rebels, non-state actors. Here you had the state go up against the regional superpower, which is Israel, and the world superpower, which is the US, and managed to get them in a stranglehold to the point that we have negotiations go on now. And I think that that's a very powerful image for the rest of the global South, that this is what indigenous capacity, this is what having the ability to, not only like propagandize, which they've done through their Lego videos, but also like make very strong legal arguments that you have the right to self-defense. Whether all of those hold water, I don't know. Like one of the key issues has been the fact that they went after US bases in the Gulf, right? They would have had to prove that that territory was used to launch the initial attack against them on February 28th. They haven't yet provided us with that evidence. There are some cases that you could say that Bahrain and Kuwait were used, but when you look at the outcome of this war, I think that's the main takeaway from the global South is that international law can be on your side, but also have might on your side. Also have your friends in the form of China and Russia. Also have the fact that, Donald Rumsfeld has this very famous quote, which is that weakness is provocative. And I think the way to get away from that is to be strong.
So how do you characterize this like being strong idea in terms of like hard power, in terms of having nuclear weapons, etc.? So you're against this idea of disarmament and you think that global South should perhaps invest heavily in hard power?
Completely.
And how is that?
I'm very much, we're sat here talking in Pakistan, right? And we know what happened in May 2025 when India attacked. That war was a 4-day war for a reason. And it was a 4-day war for a reason because you have that nuclear threshold which is looming over 2 states and which the international community is aware of, right? So they will readily jump in and be like, don't go any further. We don't know what could happen right now. In Russia, Ukraine, you don't have the same thing because Ukraine agreed to give up its whatever nuclear repository that it had at that time in the understanding that it would be protected. And so nuclear weapons do offer, I believe that the lesson from Iran and the lesson of, I think that the memes did a very good job of vindicating Kim Jong-un.
Yeah.
I think the memes coming out from about him were hilarious. And I think that they really taught you a lesson, which was that this villainous figure, which had been created, being like, he's starving his people, but he's getting nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
He was vindicated at the end, right? Who, looking at this from a historical, political, and non-biased perspective, which is what the North would like you to have, would not look at what happened to Saddam Hussein, what happened to Muammar al-Gaddafi, and what happened to Ayatollah Khamenei, and not decide that what Kim Jong-un did was the right thing to do.
True. So that he could not perhaps be the next of those assassinated ones.
Of course, right? And you can see that in the change of conversation to Kim Jong-un, right? He has now managed to align himself with Russia and with China. They have opened up to him. Russia needed to.
Yeah.
It has North Korean troops fighting in Ukraine. It also took artillery from North Korea. So in the end, what Russia and Ukraine has really taught the global South is that if you create allies among the global South, they're willing to ignore what the West keeps on hearkening onto them about, which is don't buy Russian oil, don't do all of this stuff with Russia. They're willing to ignore that because they're like, no, I'm going to do what's best for me.
Right. So with that framework in mind, let's get into what's actually happening right now. So like the recent news would tell you that Iran war technically ended with the Islamabad MOU, and like Khamenei is dead, and the new supreme leader is Mustafa Khamenei, who is not perhaps made a public appearance yet so far. So does this, and also Israel keeps striking Lebanon with no respect to the ceasefire or the deal that was signed. Does that actually count as peace to you, or does that seem like another recurring war after a brief pause?
Yeah, I think that it is so important to watch the tectonic plates of where the blocks are forming right now. And I think when we look onto this period in history, I think we are going to look back on what happened in this region last year, right? And then I'll come on to what happened this year.
Yeah.
But I think the two best things that happened for the region, for two countries in the region last year, was Narendra Modi deciding to attack Pakistan in May 2025, and the Israelis and Americans deciding to attack Iran in June 2025. I think those are the two best things to happen to Pakistan and to Iran, which sounds incredibly, ironic or upside down world. But I think that that's true. I think that Iran learned so much from that war about where its vulnerabilities are, the extent of Mossad infiltration. I think that it learned the fact that its missiles were getting jammed. They weren't really performing in the way that they wanted it to perform. And so they moved all of those onto the Chinese system. They managed to cleanse all of their networks and make sure that the infiltrators were not close to what was being decided. Pakistan also managed to show its might. It was very much the underdog in May 2025. And it came out of that with a lot of respect on the international stage, its military might being proven, but also it was a ringing endorsement of Chinese military manufacturing, right? Which everyone had been like, do these Chinese weapons actually work? And there was a lot of, looking down and condescension on Chinese weaponry.
Yeah.
And what came out of that was the fact that actually they do work, and they work kind of better than your systems because they're very, very integrated into our systems. And from that, we have a region which is just completely changed now.
Yeah.
During the course of what happened also, we learned where the Gulf countries stand.
Yes.
Right? Which is you have Qatar and Oman in the middle. The rest are completely with the US.
Yes.
We found out that Saudi was playing a very, very Zionist-headed role in terms of, publicly saying we don't want a war with Iran, privately saying go and attack Iran. The UAE has kind of completely thrown its lot in with Iran and India. With Israel and India, Since you've had the ceasefire, right? And the MOU of understanding, we kind of thought that there was indication that the Arab states were throwing their lot in with the US and Israel completely, right? And this is what winning does, right? And this is an argument that I have about Palestinian resistance too, which is that you can quote international by the yard, but once you win, you become a state, right? And that's happened to every national resistance movement. You have the ANC being declared terrorist. Nelson Mandela was a terrorist until he became the South African state. He became the representative. That's true across Africa. It's true across South Asia too, in terms of what happens when you win against a colonial power. Everything you've done in the past is kind of forgiven. Look at the FLN. We remember them as having committed gross violations against the civilian population, which they definitely did. They definitely committed war crimes, similarly to the Palestinian resistance. But we remember them as the freedom fighters too, right? But I have totally gone off on a tangent. Let me go back to the Arabs. So when we looked at it at the time, and this is why winning is so important, we kind of saw this complete schism between the Arab governments and Iran. And now it looks like there are some fragile truces being held, right? The UAE is willing to negotiate with Iran. Saudi Arabia is willing to negotiate with Iran. All of the Gulf states are now deciding, we can't change geography. Iran is there to stay. These two heavyweight superpowers, regional superpowers, global superpowers have not been able to take down Iran. We've got to work with them. And also, we cannot trust these guys to give us protection, because we thought that was, going to be what decided everything going in. They can't give us our protection. So actually, let's liaise now. Let's talk. And for Iran, I'm like, you were left out in the cold, and a lot of people did not care that, you were like the black sheep of the international community, along with North Korea. We're going to snub you. We can't interact with you. There are secondary sanctions, even if we wanted to. And now Iran has come out of that in a very, very different place. I still don't agree that it's a fourth power of the world. I think that's crazy. Probably from a Pakistani perspective, because I'm just like, we're so bent on our military prowess that I'm like, you don't have an air force. I don't know if I can see you as the fourth global power yet. But you have proved that you can leverage your indigenous technology to your will, that you have the capability by, learning your lessons from last year to go ahead and fight a war that you have come out on the top, holding the cards. And because you have come out doing that, every other state is now willing to work with you.
When, talking about the political incidents of when the abduction in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Iran, and so all within the past months, do you think that's still true right now, that US still has this free charge of its influence infiltrating everywhere? Or is something changing in how much freedom a country like the US, as the hegemon, as it proclaims, actually holds?
So I think we're on the precipice of a multipolar order. At the same time, I think there's been a lot talked about in terms of the Donroe Doctrine. And so, and a lot of, expert analysts were reporting that Venezuela could not rely on Russia and China as good allies, right? At the same time, Iran proved that that was not true. Iran proved that by winning, I will say, because I think that at the beginning, my personal take was that Russia and China had kind of come to terms with the idea that they were going to lose Iran. And it was only while the war ramped up that they were like, hey, this is looking more dicey, let's give more support, right? And now they can come out on the winning side of that. Venezuela was very different. Venezuela, I think, and when it comes to Cuba, the blackouts in Cuba have been horrendous. And Marco Rubio seems to have his sights set on Cuba being next, and Trump seems to be going along with it. Like he's so much of a sponge, you can't really tell. He just repeats whatever the last person told him was. But I do think that Russia and China kind of have this idea of a Donroe Doctrine, which is good for them. So they do look at it as like, okay, fine, you can have the Americas, give Russia Europe, and give us Asia, and we're fine. As long as you don't, interact and interrupt what we're doing in the South China Sea, which is what they want to do. As long as you don't try and make Taiwan another Ukraine, we're good. And we can have these spheres of influence. So I wonder whether that's more of the priority when it comes to looking at South America compared to the Middle East.
Coming towards locally into Pakistan. Pakistan went from a bystander country until last year that actually brokered peace between US and Iran this year. So what do you make of that and the situation in comparison with Afghanistan? So a country that is actually brokering peace on a global level is also perhaps having skirmishes on the borders with Afghanistan, at the same time being an aggressor on the neighboring side.
So I think that Pakistan has played it very, very cleverly in terms of interacting with Iran and making Iran and the US come to the table. I think that has been a high wire act. I think there are so many moving parts to this, including the fact that you are very desperate as a country, given how pro-Iran your population is, to not have the defense pact invoked with Pakistan and Saudi, right? At the same time, you want to prove that this defense pact is solid.
True.
Right? An aggression against one is an aggression against both. You want to prove that you are the country to have defense pacts with. And so that's why you had this movement of armaments and personnel to Saudi Arabia. And you had a brokering of peace, which I just think that bring all of those different entities to the table, knowing that you have a bit of a shady relationship with Iran and the US, but also that you are really the only state which can do it. You're close to the US, you're close to China, you're close to Saudi Arabia, and you're close to Iran, in the sense that Iran knows that your population is the largest Shia population outside of Iran. And it also knows that, you are the land, your neighbors. So I think that Pakistan has played that incredibly well. I don't want to overshoot that point, because I'm worried about the fact that this war is going to continue, and it could well continue. But I think that, and Pakistan is now apparently turning its mind to mediating in Libya, which does make sense, because we did have a defense agreement with Libya, which then Saudi got involved with and said, don't do this, because I don't want to really get involved in that war. And so to flip into a mediating position there too, I think that is the correct thing to do, right? At the same time, going into Afghanistan, I think that we should be very, very careful when we're going into Afghanistan, particularly the arguments for which we are going into Afghanistan. The way India attacked you after Pahalgam, when there was no evidence of a link between what happened at Pahalgam and what happened in Pakistan, you, as a responsible international law-abiding state, you do not want to recreate those arguments in Afghanistan, right? I do believe that action needs to be taken against the TTP and against elements of the BLA, which are conducting these attacks against their security forces. I don't think that Pakistan can let that slide. But at the same time, those attacks should either be within your territory or they should be with the consent of the Taliban government. And I think that given you had a close relationship with the Taliban government for a long time, I think that consent could in some way be brokered. And I think that Pakistan should go through that avenue.
Talk about ideological, like how ideology has become more militant and more political in the status quo. So like the way Zionism has entered into American lobbying and into the international law as well. So you've written down on Zionism and Hindutva, both how they grew out of the same fascist playbook and how that ideology then gets built into actual state policy. It manifests into state governance, etc. And lobbying, the way that Israeli government or Israeli Zionist government does with American lobbying. Like we've seen this even in India as well. So when an ideology like that gets that sort of embedded in states' foreign policy, in states' like states' governance, what does international law actually have to say about it, or how does international law take that into account? Is there a real legal language for it, or does the law stay silent on ideology and only look at the conduct of it?
So the link between the Zionist and Hindutva movements is incredibly, incredibly interesting in terms of, we see such a growing alliance between India and Israel. And I would definitely refer everyone to read Hostile Homelands by Asad Issa, because he goes into this in so much depth, and it's a great book. When it comes to international law, international human rights law might have a lot to say about how a state interacts with its own individuals. So say, I don't like the term Israeli Arabs, because I think it's there to, take away their Palestinian heritage. But the idea of how a state treats its own citizens and whether it's discriminatory in a way, we can look at that in the sense of apartheid in Israel, which would come into that, and that would be under international criminal law too. But in terms of going to war with another state, that wouldn't have an impact in the kind of international law that I'm interested in. But it would be under international human rights law.
Great. So you use the term apartheid. Why won't you use the term genocide? There's this nuance of the terminology that you use in international law and generally lawyers use in distinguishing apartheid, genocide, crimes against humanity, and aggression or war crimes, etc. So how are these terms exclusively different for different spaces, and what is the significance of using them like exclusively?
It's really... I'm very annoying about it, because it's incredibly important legally purely by virtue of classification, right? As lawyers, that's what we do. We try and categorize what is what is because it fulfills these criteria. What is this because it fulfills those? I don't believe that there is a hierarchy of what these crimes are. I believe that a crime against humanity can be as bad as a war crime, can be as bad as an act of genocide. For me, it's a purely academic exercise of classification, right? The reason why the political rhetoric I find very annoying is this. And I remember at the beginning of the Gaza war, there was this whole thing going around on social media, which was that it's not war, it's genocide. How dare you call it a war? And I was like, it can be both. It is definitely a war because you want international law of armed conflict to apply. Of course, that would apply to what's going on in Gaza. At the same time, it can be genocide. It can be war crimes. It can be crimes against humanity. And I think that there was evidence that all three were being committed in the Gaza Strip at that time, right? At the same time, it can also be an apartheid state. So I think that actually all of those things were fulfilled. And I think that the political rhetoric really got in the way of us being able to argue that there was this classification in some ways, because the popular trend was that if you were calling it a war, you were downgrading it in a way. You were kind of like dismissing what's going on because it's just a war. And I was like, no, because the term war itself is very legally defined. I mean, we don't call it war under the laws of war. We call it an armed conflict, right? So what you had in the Gaza Strip was an occupation of a territory. You also had a non-international armed conflict taking place between Israel and between Hamas, right? At the same time, Israel's conduct of that war ultimately became genocidal because it was against the Palestinian population to the point that I believe that there was a specific intent. Genocide is incredibly hard to prove because you need a specific intent. So even when it came to the Second World War, ethnic cleansing is not genocide, right? So a lot of people get those confused because they argued that, you know, you're trying to drive them all out. And I'm like, the notion that you're driving them all out means that it's not genocide because you're not trying to destroy them, right? So one of the great tells of genocide was in the Second World War. Right, and this came to the fore in the Eichmann case, where they said up until 1942, what the Nazis were doing was trying to get rid of all of the Jews from their territory by driving them out. Ethnic cleansing, crime against humanity, not genocide.
Yes.
They decided around 1942 that actually that policy was not working because they kept on coming back. Then they decided to close borders. Now we destroy them, right? From then it became genocidal. And so I think that there came a point for me where I was arguing it was not genocide up until May 2024, when I said, now I believe we are squarely within Article 2C of the Genocide Convention, which is deliberately inflicting upon people conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. And I believe that the starvation of civilians, this starvation of Palestinians could not have been anything but genocidal, right? So I think that this argument that, they're trying to drive them out to the Sinai misses the point, because that's not what they were doing. The borders were closed. You knew the borders were closed, and you were deliberately trying to starve Palestinians. And for me, that then fell into genocide. Because there was so much of a political uproar about it, it felt like you could only be accepted if you said it was genocide from October 8th, 2023. And I was like, I just don't think it is, from a purely legal academic point of view. And I think that there is a kind of thought that I have about this, which is the killing fields in Cambodia were a crime against humanity, right? They were not genocide. I don't want it to be that you tell those victims, you only had a crime against humanity, you didn't have the ultimate crime of genocide, right? I don't think that is correct. Just like when it was a crime against humanity being committed against the Gaza Strip, I didn't think that was less bad than, May 2025. You added things onto it. It became both a crime against humanity and genocide. But I don't think that that's the way it should work. At the same time, in a non-lawyer's imagination, genocide looms as the ultimate crime, right? And so we can't also ignore the fact that when it comes to international criminal tribunals, often the accused will say, please get rid of the genocide charge, and I'm happy to remain with the crime against humanity charge. So we can't ignore the way that this is interpreted by a non-legal crowd. But at the same time, I think that there is an importance to these legal terms. They've developed over a number of decades. And there's a reason why we have them, and it's purely for categorization. So I kind of thought that, when South Africa brought the case, I didn't think it was a genocide at the time. I thought that you're waging a war, and you're committing war crimes, and you're committing crimes against humanity, but the court wouldn't have had jurisdiction unless it was genocide. But at the same time, I kind of thought that if you let Israel off for a genocide, everyone is going to see that as an exoneration, and it's not that. It's that you just haven't committed this crime. You've committed all of the others, which we can't really try you for here. But it didn't mean what people said it means. Yeah.
Great. Okay. We previously talked about the Afghanistan and the Pakistan conflict, but coming towards the Afghanistan TTP issue, I want to shift something to... You've written on this before, right? So you've written on the gender apartheid, the debate around gender apartheid around Afghanistan. So gender apartheid has become the go-to term for what Afghan women are living through. As someone who studies this legally, how do you actually see that term, and how does it hold up, or is it something that is getting lost within the interpretation of it?
I think it's a purely politically motivated, attempt to create a crime. And I know what happens in Geneva behind the stage, right? So I've heard reports from what is being discussed there. That doesn't make it to the legal document, which comes out as a result of the resolutions that they have, which is that they want a politically motivated crime, which would go against the Taliban and Iran. There would be no other country to which this crime would attach, and they're okay with that. They're very happy with that, right? So I know that it is very politically motivated. I also just think that it doesn't make any sense. Racial apartheid makes complete sense. You're segregating roads, you're segregating, one race of people from another race of people. And we saw that in apartheid South Africa. Legal jurists such as John Dugard, who came from apartheid South Africa, went to Israel and said, this is way worse than happened way back when, right? When we were undergoing our apartheid. And so you have a racial apartheid there. You have, even in maternity wards, you have Jewish mothers there who are like, I don't not want to be next to an Arab. And they're kept in separate wards, right? You have roads that Palestinians cannot go on. That is a racial apartheid, right? It is that notion of keeping another race separate and subjugated. You do not have that when it comes to, you can have gender persecution, but you do not have that when it comes to the Taliban in Afghanistan, because both sexes live and stay together. You have one sex which is not allowed to do certain things. That definitely comes under gender persecution. The use of the word apartheid, they have used on purpose for it to be triggering. They've used it on purpose so it can be politically motivated. And they've done it on purpose to, further ostracize the Taliban government. And my argument is that we know what's going on in the Taliban. We know that you have these, Kabuli hardliners, and you have the Kabuli moderates, and the Kandahari hardliners, and they're kind of at war with each other because a lot of people in that do think that women should be able to go to school. What you have done is further isolate the Taliban in Afghanistan, and you further empowered the Kandahari, hardliners in going ahead with this, because they're just like, well, we're isolated anyway. We have nothing to gain. And so we should just go hardcore on this. This is why they hate us. We should do this even more, right? That seems to be the reception from the Taliban. And the argument would be that you should have greater engagement with the Taliban. And in light of what persecution is being undertaken by the women there. And I also think that there are so many aspects to this, which you have the International Criminal Court, which has come out with arrest warrants for the Taliban in light of the crime of gender persecution, which is, I think that they fulfill the elements and the criteria of that crime, right? At the same time, when Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, came into power, the first thing that he did was deprioritize American crimes in Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan ratified the Rome Statute. So on its territory, you have ICC jurisdiction. So in doing that, you have already done something which is inherently political. And so I feel like this is just further adding to it. And then you have, famous mouthpieces like Malala Yousafzai trying to argue to concoct this other crime. And I think that we know you've lost the war. and you're trying to get against the Taliban for doing that. It's not like the 20-year occupation did much for women at the time. And if they did, they didn't do it for a lot of the Pashtun women in the countryside. And the reports out of Afghanistan are very mixed. If you look at some of the new books coming out, a lot of people have gone around the court system there. They said that there is a reason why the Taliban is being supported by some women in the countryside is because they're getting their inheritance rights through Taliban courts, which are actually finally working. They're getting other Islamic rights, which they weren't getting before, right? So I think that the picture is much more nuanced than, you know, this very famous political term of what is apartheid, what isn't. And I'm very, very cynical of countries coming out and declaring something to be gender apartheid when you have an actual racial apartheid going on in Israel-Palestine, which none of these states, such as Australia, Canada, or the Netherlands, they have never spoken up about how that is an actual genocide. Actually, what they want to do is say there is no apartheid going on there, right? But what you should be looking at is this gender apartheid, a completely new term, which means very little, that is going on in Afghanistan. And I'm like, no, how about we look at the actual apartheid going on? And how about we refuse this moniker that you created, politically motivated just for the Taliban?
So also, do you think that this playing around with terminologies, does it also contribute to fueling the fire for Islamophobia? So perhaps like countries like Iran and Afghanistan are so much against women. This narrative is something that is cashed on by social commentators to argue that perhaps Islam is something very conservative, or these states are such hardliners against women. Is it something that also fuels Islamophobia?
I think it definitely has this like very uncomfortable Islamic tint to it, right? At the same time, there's no ignoring the fact that these countries claim to do it in the name of Islam too. But with Iran, it's very interesting because you did have, you know, articles come out by Brookings, an American think tank, which said, are Iranian women overeducated? Are they too educated? And when you look at, you know, Iranian women, the fact that some of them are like nuclear scientists, the fact that they have the most educated women in the Middle East are in Iran. And so for us, we look at that as something which is that, no, so what if women have to wear a piece of cloth on their head if you are fulfilling all of these other rights which are owed to them? Ultimately, what has happened is that you had protests in Iran where women said, we don't want to wear this, all right? And now they have relaxed those requirements. And I think that anything which comes from the people has to be from the people themselves. So if this is imposed on Pakistani women, I don't want foreign NGOs coming and telling us, actually, you should not be for this. I would want Pakistani women themselves to decide, are we in favor of this or are we not? There will be, you know, both. You will have Pakistani women who will say, yes, I do believe that this is our Islamic requirement. We should all be covered up. And you will have women who will say, no, we don't want to impose on us. If you want to do it, you do it, but don't impose it on everyone. And both of those things should like battle it out in the marketplace of ideas, right? In a state, you should have both groups of women kind of fight that out. And that's exactly what you had in Iran. It became so powerful after Mahsa Amini. You had those riots and those protests, and Iranian women were like, we just don't want to do this. Ultimately, the government had to comply with that, right? And so now you have a complete relaxation of that. The same thing will happen for Afghan women. The same thing will happen for Pakistani women in what they decide they want and what they decide they don't want. The worst thing, I think, is to have foreign intervention. Because you don't persuade anyone like that. We are very, very critical of what comes in from abroad, right? So the idea of like you're creating all of these foreign NGOs which are only arguing about this one point, whether you wear a piece of cloth on your head or not, but they don't care about the other, you know, rights to a flourishing life that Pakistani women, Iranian women, Afghan women want. I don't trust that at all. And I think that everyone is right to mistrust that.
So given everything that you've just said, where's the line for you between fairly calling out that selectiveness and accidentally speaking over the same Afghan women who are leading this fight for themselves?
So I think that what keeps on happening is that you have diaspora women speaking for women in the country, right? And I think that we've seen that there's a lot in terms of the Taliban coming out. There are all of these diaspora women who don't really live in Afghanistan and who don't represent the entire spectrum of women in Afghanistan either. And you can't have that, right? You can't have some woman who has lived in the US, in the UK, and Australia, such as Yalda Hakim, she likes to do this a lot. You can't have her be representative of your average Pashtun Afghan woman who lives in the countryside, who wants completely different things, and who in some way is like, no, I like this about the Taliban, but I dislike this about the Taliban, right? You have to actually have those voices being represented. And I believe that really I'm just very cynical of what happens when it comes out of diaspora women. And I think that we can never forget what happened in the Iraq War, where you had Ahmed Jalabi being relied upon, as well as a source called Curveball was their entire evidence for the Americans to go into Iraq. And you can all look this up. It's pretty insane when you start to look this up. And he was actually an Iraqi dissident who wanted power. And so I think that these people have their own myriad of interests, and they can't really be trusted for you to rely on what they're saying for you to go into a country. And ultimately, if anyone is asking, and we see this with the Iranian diaspora, I mean, I think that they're pretty horrific. If someone is saying, please go and bomb my country, I would just never trust that person. If that person is saying, I am going to go to Afghanistan and I'm going to go and try and, do what's right for the women of Afghanistan and talk to them and kind of highlight what they want to have to say. And I think that Anand Gopal did a really great version of this for the New Yorker. Those people I would take so much more seriously than your average, diaspora living in New York or London who is saying that they know what's right for the country.
Great. Thank you so much for all of your insights, and it was great having you here.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.